Hello, everybody. Welcome to TESOL 2250. This is week 12, day 2, and this is going to be a little bit longer of a video for the varieties part of structure and varieties, because there are several linked pages on these slides that I'm going to ask you to look at, because there's some videos I want you to watch and listen to. We're going to be looking at a few different varieties of English, and you really need to hear these varieties through these video clips to understand them well. So everywhere there's a place where there's a link, I'm going to point it out to you. I'm going to post these slides under week 12 so that you can click on the video links through them. So what I would recommend is that you pull up these slides as you're watching this video, periodically pause the video and then click on the link in the slides to watch the video. So we're going to talk a little bit about language and dialect contact, and then a little bit of code switching with a few examples from Chicano English, African American language that we're going to highlight. Okay, so let's talk about language contact. Now, language contact is not just language contact, but it can also be dialect contact. And this is when you've got two or more distinct languages or dialects that come into contact with each other, either directly through social interaction of the speakers or indirectly through the media or education. And language contact, in, for example, colonial times, language contact was exactly as it sounds, right? You had groups of people that were traveling to another foreign land and meeting other groups of people that didn't speak the same language for the first time, and trying to get along and trying to figure out how they could communicate was a big part of language contact. Nowadays, because of the media and because, we have the internet, we get a lot more exposure to different languages and different dialects without even having to leave our homes. So we see a lot more of what we call dialect contact that's happening now, and less language contact as we did in earlier times in history. So there are a number of things that can happen when languages and dialects can come into contact with one another. For one, you can get borrowing. What that means is that you transfer words or lexical items from one language or dialect to another, or even some structural properties from one language or dialect to the other. That can happen. Another thing is something called language convergence. This is where two languages or dialects become much more alike. Now, you pointed out when you watched the American Tongues video, that map of the United States that showed the migration of people from the eastern side of the United States to the western side, and how you had distinct colors, maybe 4 distinct colors of 4 distinct dialects that all kind of merged together over time. And this is an example of language, or in this case, dialect convergence. And they started to become more and more similar and less distinct, as we saw on the East Coast. And this is exactly what's happening, with dialects in the United States. As we have more access to the internet and more access to different dialects around the country, dialects are no longer so isolated anymore as they used to be. We can travel, we can drive by car, we can fly in a plane to different places very quickly. And that just never used to be possible. So the result is that we're actually losing a lot of dialectal diversity. As more dialects start to converge and become more similar to each other, we look at now versus even 40 years ago, which is right around when that American Tongues was filmed, and we see such a huge difference, or 35 years ago, I think. We see such a huge difference. There are much more intense microcultures and micro dialects within the United States, and that are just kind of going away now. Now we actually talk a lot more similar to one another, whether you're from the West or you're from the North or the South or New England area, wherever you're from. We're starting to sound a lot more similar to one another. And this is the result of convergence. Another thing that can happen is language death. Now, this is when one language group conquers another. Usually that's the case. But this can happen on a smaller level with dialects. As I said before, some dialects are just disappearing. They're kind of being absorbed into the mainstream dialect or the standard dialect that we're starting to see around the country. Now, language death, of course, is much more striking, again, when we consider the colonial times when you had colonization of the Americas. And, one group literally conquered the other. And this is where we had language death, particularly of Native American languages in the United States. We see a lot of language death in those instances. Another thing that can happen is the creation of bilingual mixed languages, or pidgins and creoles. Now, the bilingual mixed languages and pidgins and creoles, that's a little bit outside of the scope of this class. However, I did teach a class in heritage languages in California, and we talked a lot about these things. And so I've actually hidden some slides in my slideshow. If you want to know more about bilingual mixed languages and pidgins and creoles, you can take a look at some of those. There's some video clips in there that are kind of interesting as well, too. Now, usually when you have this happening, it's usually because the languages in contact, and it can be two or more languages, often sort of have kind of an equal status in many instances. Okay, so you have language or dialect contact, or you have exposure to multiple different dialects. And we already know that we have different registers that we speak in. You can kind of think of these as almost like different dialects. And what happens is we do something called code switching. So if you're in a multilingual or multidialectal community and you go back and forth between two languages or dialects in the same conversation, you're doing something called code switching. Or if you vary your language to meet the needs of a particular audience, you are code switching. And we do this all the time. Sometimes we do it consciously, and other times we do it unconsciously. So, and code switching can happen anywhere. You can be in a multilingual community, you can be a multidialectal community, or you can be in a monolingual or monodialectal community. Although I would argue that in a monodialectal community, that just simply doesn't exist. There's never a monodialectal community because there are always a variety of different dialects all around you, and at least there are different registers for sure. So when you switch back and forth between different registers, you are doing a very subtle version of code switching. And you do this for a number of reasons. So you might do what we call strategic code switching when you consciously adopt another code in order to signal identity with the members who use that code. And politicians are famous for doing this, right? They'll often adopt a dialect of the group or demographic they're trying to reach, they're trying to get votes for. And, this can be used when they want to gain power or status or fans or membership, whatever. So this is an example of strategic code switching. Now, I've linked a video here. So this is the first video link, and this is of Hillary Clinton and her dialect from 1983 to 2007. And she's addressing different audiences in various speeches. And you can hear her dialect is very, very different in each of these speeches. Now, with this and most of the other videos that you're going to look at today, I would recommend looking at the very beginning of the video and then looking at the very end of the video and just see how much difference there is between 1983 and 2007. It's a lot easier to see that when you look at the two extremes. So the link is here. The full link is down here to the YouTube video. So if you want to take a minute, pause the video, go ahead and look at Hillary Clinton's dialect. It's a 5-minute video, and you can come back. Okay, so you've seen an example of conscious code switching or strategic code switching. Most code switching, though, tends to happen unconsciously. And that is just, something that we do without even realizing it. My husband, for example, does a lot of unconscious code switching. He's lived everywhere. He's from the New England area, but he's also lived in the South. He's lived in just about every state. And it's interesting, when he starts talking about memories from certain times in his childhood, he'll either switch into more of a New England accent or more of a Southern dialect, depending on what time frame he's referring to. If he's referring to his teenage years, he'll oftentimes refer to them in more of a Southern accent. That's when he was living in Tennessee. But when he refers to early childhood, he goes more into a New England accent. And he sounds like he's more of a New Englander because he's recounting a story of childhood, and that's when he lived in New England. And this is one of the things I really liked about him when I first met him. I said, I have to figure out what your dialect is because it was so interesting to me. And, that's why I started dating him. Anyway, so we have a lot of unconscious code switching that happens. We just sort of slip into the dialect of our upbringing, whatever that may be. And that happens most frequently when you're recounting a story of your childhood, or when you're in kind of a heightened emotional state, like maybe you're really angry or sad or happy, or just tired or sleepy, something like that. I have a friend originally from Ohio, so she's from the Midwest, and but she's been living in California for probably a little over a decade now, maybe about a decade. And she sounds very much like she's from California most of the time. But when she's really sleepy or when she's had a couple of drinks, the Ohio starts to show. And I definitely hear it, and I definitely notice it. And sometimes I'll say your Ohio is showing. So this happens, right? And I've put another wonderful little link here of a man who's telling a story about the Irish tea man. This is an Irish man who's been living in England for a long time. And once again, with this video, watch the whole thing through, but then go back and just listen to the beginning of the video when he introduces the story and the end of the video. And you will see he starts to sound more and more Irish as time goes on. And you can really hear it at the extremes, the beginning and the end. So there's a big difference. So just pause this video for now. Go ahead and click that link for the Irish tea man and listen to his story. So code switching can happen in monolingual communities. Again, monolingual and monodialectal. There's probably no such thing as a monodialectal community, but nevertheless, there are some communities that have a little bit less dialect diversity. And even in these communities, you can still hear a more subtle version of code switching. So for example, this was a movie that came out, I don't remember, it was a long time ago, probably in 2002. I feel like I was in early college then, so it's probably about 2002. But it's called Malibu's Most Wanted. And, for lack of better terminology, the character here, his name is Brad, but he goes by B-Rad. And, he's a white guy that adopts a quote unquote Black dialect. Okay. And it's horribly offensive, but it's also kind of a good example of what people do all the time. They adopt a dialect that they think is cooler, frankly, that they think is more interesting or exciting, or for whatever reason they may. And so there's a little video link here. Oops, sorry, I didn't include the link, but you can just click on that YouTube or copy and paste that YouTube link. And you're going to hear some examples of this. And that's actually, part of the comedy of this movie is him adopting a dialect of a community he's definitely not a part of. He is a politician's son, a very rich politician's son, and he's trying to adopt the dialect of a community he knows nothing about. And they're trying to teach him a lesson that he should stop acting Black, basically. Anyway, so if you haven't seen that movie, do check it out. Again, it can be horribly offensive, but it is kind of insightful in some ways. So, we do this a lot, right? I think of the travel agent, for example. When a travel agent talks to different customers from all around the country, they'll either do conscious or unconscious code switching to accommodate to those people. And it can make people feel more comfortable. If you're talking to somebody who has a similar dialect to you, you can feel more comfortable. On the other hand, if you don't accommodate to your audience, it can kind of feel like you're trying to alienate yourself from them or distance yourself from them. So, again, we talked about this with respect to registers. For example, like a teenager, they're not going to really talk to their grandparents the same way they talk to their friends. No, they're going to accommodate to each group. And, young people, youths often adopt non-standard dialects outside of their community, like we see with Brad and Malibu's Most Wanted. he thinks it's cool. And that's often the reason why we do. The other example I gave earlier was, my husband constantly code switching to different dialects when he's talking about different topics that relate to his childhood. So these are all examples of code switching in monolingual communities. Now, we're going to look at a couple of examples of different varieties of English in a little more detail. So the first one is Chicano English. Now, I just came from Southern California not too long ago. And in Southern California, you will hear a lot of Chicano English. And I lived in the San Diego metro region, very, very close to the Mexican border. So this is the case. You get Chicano English because you have a very high percentage of bilinguals, of Spanish-English bilinguals, centered around Southern California, the Mexico-US border. Okay. Now, what happens is that in a highly bilingual community, you actually will have the quote unquote minority language, which in this case is Spanish, actually influencing the majority language. And this is how we get Chicano English. Chicano English is not a bilingual mixed language. It's not Spanglish. That's something different. Chicano English is actually a variety of English, which is heavily influenced by Spanish. So the interesting thing, and the reason why we call it Chicano English and not, Spanglish, is because this is spoken by fluent and often monolingual English speakers. It is the variety of English that they acquire from the time that they're born, and they grow up using it amongst other speakers. And I'm going to show you a video of it as well, too, and you can listen to what Chicano English sounds like. A lot of these folks do not speak Spanish. So if you tried to communicate to them in Spanish, they wouldn't necessarily understand. This is just the English that they learned. And it's very, very different, say, from the English that's spoken by Spanish speakers learning English. Very different, okay? Chicano English speakers have learned English perfectly, but the variety of English they speak is non-standard. And there's a prolonged contact with Spanish over many, many generations in the community. And in fact, maybe some of their parents may speak Spanish or grandparents. But the key here is that this is only spoken by native speakers of English, just a different variety. So I'm going to skip that for just a second because I just want to get to where the video is. I can tell you about some of the characteristics of Chicano English, but it's much easier to just hear it. So there's this video here by Carmen Fott about Chicano English that's filmed in Southern California. So take a listen to this too, and listen to this variety of English that you hear. So go ahead and pause that video. Take a look at the Chicano English video. Oop, I started it. Sorry, I didn't realize I started it. All right, so this kind of gets into, something I asked you about a little bit earlier, a couple of weeks ago. What is standard English? And I wanted to get your thoughts before we really delved into this a little bit more. What is standard English? Well, some dialects of English, like Chicano English or African American language, which we're going to see here in a minute, are seen as less correct or less systematic or less polite or less educated, or even, I've heard this term before, lower or broken forms of English. Now, this is absolutely not correct. However, whenever a particular variety of English gets this kind of label, this is usually a non-standard variety of English, like Chicano English or African American language. So, where do these stigmas come from? Often they come from speakers of standard varieties of English, and they often place these judgments on non-standard varieties of speakers. And in fact, sometimes non-standard variety speakers tend to adopt these same viewpoints. They'll even say something like, yeah, I know my English is not very good, or it's not correct. We saw this a little bit in the American Tongues video with the African American girls. Two of them chose to speak like the members of their community. And one of them said, I don't want to talk that way. I don't think it sounds right. I don't think it sounds very educated, or something along those lines. And so even non-standard variety speakers can adopt some of these negative stigmas and viewpoints because they're often kind of corrected, or they're kind of given a lot of negative feedback saying your variety is not correct. Now, I have said it before, and I will say it again 500 times probably this semester. There is no dialect of English, there's no language that is more or less superior than another. That is, that any variety of English that we speak is always going to be just as systematic and just as capable of expressing the complexity of human thought as any other variety of English. Okay? So when we get these kinds of stigmas, it usually happens for social reasons, not because of linguistic reasons. So let's look at what a standard variety is versus a non-standard variety. A standard variety is a mutually intelligible form of the language that speakers of all dialects can understand. Now, really, there is no one standard variety of English. You know, even if we think about where English is spoken, it's spoken all over the world, and we looked at global English and international English. Now, these are different concepts from standard English. Standard refers to, more often the language of government, and the one that we can all kind of understand regardless of our individual varieties of English. We really don't have a standard version. Some people might say, oh, well, British English is the standard version, but even within British English, there are so many other micro dialects. And in American English, we could say, well, maybe that's the standard. Well, same here. In the United States, we have so many micro dialects depending on where you are in the country. Literally, you can go from one city to another and there's a different dialect. So we don't really have a standard variety, but more like, different groups of standard, right? Like there's kind of a standard American, and there's a standard British, and maybe a standard Australian, and so on and so forth. So how are standards determined? Well, this has a lot to do with power and money. So if the locus of power or the locus of government is located in a particular city, for example, of a country, then that usually ends up being the standard. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that standard variety is necessarily correct or better or even more commonly spoken than the language of the rest of the country. It's just that's where the government happens to be. And the government, of course, will put out media and official documents that get disseminated throughout the rest of the country. And so this usually is how the standards are determined. The standards are determined by the people in power. Whoever's in power, whatever their dialect may be, that's often what the rest of the country is going to determine as being standard and incorrectly determine as being superior. Now, there are some advantages of having a standard dialect, particularly depending on the country you're in. This can be more or less advantageous. First, if you have a country where there are lots and lots of different dialects that are not very intelligible to one another, it can make different groups more easily intelligible to one another, And this is not with respect to English, but I think of, for example, in China. China has multiple dialects, many, many dialects, which are actually different languages in their own right. They're not easily intelligible. And even if there are different languages, there are also sub-dialects within those languages too, that are really difficult to understand. So if you have a standard dialect that everybody can understand, it really helps to make groups easily more intelligible to one another. And it also has the advantage of unification, right? If you have a standard dialect that everybody kind of knows and speaks, then everyone can feel included. And you're not really sitting there wondering if that person over there or those people over there are talking about you and you don't really know. But for all the advantages that there are to a standard dialect, there are a number of disadvantages. For one, you have to learn to express yourself in a non-native dialect if you are a non-standard variety speaker. And that can be really, really challenging. We're going to watch a video about a school called Lucy Laney, where the majority of students, about 90% of them, are African American, and they use African American English. And when there's a point at which a teacher points out, like, in a way, these students have to come to school every day and they have to speak another language, basically, or a different dialect. And, it can be really daunting to these little children to be kind of implicitly told, hey, your dialect, it's not enough. It's not the right thing. And, they have to basically learn a different dialect to communicate with. And so if you're already struggling to learn other concepts, now you're essentially learning another language on top of that. It can be really challenging. Another disadvantage is that language is so tied, and dialect is so tied to a person's identity and their culture and just our general diversity. And so, kind of forcing people into one particular pathway on one particular dialect really often results in a loss of identity and culture and diversity. As a lot of times these non-standard varieties might get completely discarded. As I mentioned earlier, it can create a sense of linguistic superiority. The fact that we all agree on one particular dialect doesn't inherently make it superior, but people often kind of internalize it that way. And the result of that is that, we say, okay, well, the standard dialect is what students need. And I think about this from the perspective as an ESL teacher, English as a second language. I'm constantly kind of in this battle of, well, students really, they need to learn English because it's the language of opportunity. And particularly they need to learn the standard dialect of English because it's what they're going to use for education, for their jobs, their career advancement, etc. But then the problem with that is that oftentimes students will say, well, why learn any other dialect but the standard? And then it becomes kind of what we call a subtractive effect. So English or standard variety of English, is learned at the exclusion of other dialects. And so we kind of push out other dialects. And this is what contributes to language and dialect death in this case. So I want to reiterate a couple of things about varieties and social group identification, some of which I've already said, but I'll say it again. There is no such thing as broken English. There's only a standard variety and non-standard varieties. That's it. These are different dialects. The standard variety is most likely the variety of people in power. And then whenever they have some sort of negative view about perceived incorrectness of non-standard varieties, that's usually because of social and political reasons. And it's not because the non-standard variety actually lacks structure or rules. In fact, sometimes a non-standard variety might have a construction, a linguistic construction that expresses a particular concept easier than the standard variety does. Whereas where the standard variety might take a whole, several sentences to say something, a non-standard variety might have a particular word or construction that expresses it more concisely. All varieties of English are equally capable of expressing the complexity of human thought, including non-standard varieties. Despite negative social views about non-standard dialects, even negative views that the speakers have themselves, a lot of speakers of non-standard dialects might choose to continue using their dialect for a variety of reasons. They want to continue to show group conformity or affiliation. And there's also kind of a funny little clip by Key and Peele, which you should totally watch. You'll see a very good example of code switching in this. Okay, it's just like a 2-minute video. So just pause the video for a second and just listen to that. Okay, so I'm curious to see what you think about this. My mother is from the island of Trinidad. Trinidad and Tobago is 2 islands, but she's from Trinidad. And it's in the South Caribbean. If you look at where it is on a map, it's just north of Venezuela. Now, Trinidad was ruled by the British until the early 1950s. My mother was just a very, very young child, but she still remembers it was under British rule. After the British left and turned over governance to the people of Trinidad, the schools and everything and the government still functioned under a British model. So my mother was raised speaking English. English is her native language. However, it's a different variety of English. It's Trinidadian English, and it's called a Creole. It's sort of debatable whether it's actually a Creole or not. You'll see this same link is in my earlier slides that I've hidden about Creoles. But it's Trinidadian English. It is a dialect of English. Now, I'm curious. I want you to just take a listen to this video, and I'm going to show it again when we're in class. And I want you to see if you can understand what they're saying. And I want you to think, is this broken English? So pause the video right now. Go ahead and take a listen to that. So that is the dialect. Trinidadian English is the dialect I grew up hearing my whole life from my mother, but more specifically from my grandmother. Now, my grandmother maintained that dialect a lot, but because my mother was fairly young when she came to the United States, she actually lost her Trinidadian accent. And I know this because when I was just a very, very small child, I used to correct my mother when she would say things with a Trini accent, or to use a different non-standard linguistic construction. I would correct her a lot. So I remember that she used to have a much stronger Trinidadian accent. Now that, of course, diminished over time. My mother came to this country when she was just before her 13th birthday. So it's still kind of like at the end of maybe at the end of a critical period for language and dialect shift. And what's interesting is my mom is number 6 of 7 children. Okay. Now, my aunts and uncles, who were the oldest, they all really maintained that Trinidadian English accent. And then as they get progressively younger and further in, then the accent is less and less. So my mom's older sisters both have much more of a Trinidadian accent. My mom's youngest sister, the one youngest, does not have one at all. But my grandmother always maintained it. And that was what I grew up hearing a lot. And there are a number of linguistic constructions that are, I think, a lot easier to express in Trinidadian English than in standard American English. And I'm going to show you a couple of those on Friday. Now, finally, I'd like for you to view this video. As I said before, this is a Minneapolis public school called Lucy Laney Elementary. And the home dialect of students at this school is mostly African American English. About 90% of these kids are African American. And I want you to watch what they have done to validate that variety of English for these children. It's a short video, but it's very insightful. So go ahead and pause the video and watch that at this time. Expanding on Lucy Laney, we're going to watch a longer documentary called Talking Black in America. It's from 2018. And so, now it's 2023. And so some of the dialects that you're going to hear have actually changed since then. So it is kind of amazing. Dialects shift very, very quickly. The slang that's in one particular generation at a particular time, even just a few years later, can change. But I want you to think back to when we were watching American Tongues from, what was that, 1988? Again, big difference in these two documentaries and how much has changed. So this film centers around African American language, as it's called. This goes by a lot of different names: African American language, African American English, African American Vernacular English, or AAVE. Before that, it was called Ebonics. Okay. So I want you to consider how even African American English has changed since the 1980s, when American Tongues was filmed. So there's going to be a few questions on the discussion board, so make sure you take a look at that discussion board as you're watching this. I've put the YouTube link here. If that link doesn't work for some reason, we have it through SUU Library Streaming Service, so you click this link, but it's going to require that you authenticate if you're not already logged in the SUU network. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on Friday.